Assurance is a huge part of the goal of my YouTube ministry, but people will often say, well, Ortlund is a Calvinist, so he really can't have assurance. And when people make this critique, it shows that they probably have not read historic Calvinists, because this is an emphasis in the Reformed tradition. To go back to Turretin, he has a whole section in the Institutes affirming that believers can be certain of their own election with a certainty not only conjectural and moral, but infallible and of faith. That's the title of a whole section of the Institutes. And in his historical context, as you can see from the heading there, he is opposing the alternative views of assurance from Roman Catholics and Arminians. He was saying, for Turretin and other Calvinists, assurance was a special point of emphasis. You especially see that in the Puritans.
With all due respect to Gavin, what this actually demonstrates is that critics have failed to read, or not that critics have failed to read historical Calvinists, but it demonstrates that Gavin here has not engaged the current analytic philosophical literature on the epistemic implications of exhaustive divine determinism. So older Reformed theologians often asserted, and Gavin here is reading, it's like, look at the title of this. This is what they're saying. Yes, they're asserting this stuff. They're asserting that assurance is possible under their system. They're just saying it. But assertions are not arguments. So when one evaluates the logical structure of Ed using contemporary epistemology, the issue becomes painfully clear. So if all of your theological beliefs, including the belief that you are saved, are the causal output of God's determining decree, then none of them are epistemically justified. So this is not just an emotional objection. And Phil and I talked about this in our papers, but this is a straightforward argument in analytic epistemology and the philosophy of mind. So let's talk about some arguments here. Again, I want you to see the difference between asserting things and arguing for things. Phil and I argued. So argument number one, I've got several arguments to run through here. Ed entails a deceptive God. If Ed Calvinism is going to lead to a deity of deception. So it goes like this. Premise one, if Ed is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm at least some false theological beliefs. So now this is easy to defend. This is admitted by every Calvinist who acknowledges doctrinal disagreements among regenerate believers, right? This is why we go to the EPS and the ETS and have these conversations and these debates, because regenerate believers are disagreeing on so many things. All right, so number two, if God determines Christians to affirm false theological beliefs, then God is a deity of deception, right? And on top of that, his word cannot function as a reliable guide to truth because a deity of deception inspired scripture. So then the next premise is three, God is not a deity of deception. And then finally, therefore, Ed is false. Exhaustive divine determinism, or Ed Calvinism, is false. So if Ed is false, then the Calvinist who affirms Ed is going to have some problems and isn't going to have assurance of salvation. Let me explain. Next argument, premise one. No theological belief is justified if it's fully explained by untrustworthy antecedent conditions. 2. If that is true, then all theological beliefs are fully explained by untrustworthy antecedent conditions. 3. Therefore, if that is true, then no theological belief is justified. 4. Ed is itself a theological belief. 5. Therefore, a belief in Ed is not justified. Now, that's going to include the Calvinist belief that he's one of the elect. So the assurance becomes epistemically impossible, not merely psychologically difficult, but philosophically incoherent. Let me give one more. 1. No theological belief is justified if it's fully explained by untrustworthy antecedent conditions. 2. If Ed is true, then all theological beliefs are fully explained by untrustworthy antecedent conditions. 3. Therefore, if Ed is true, no theological belief is justified. 4. An assurance of salvation is a theological belief. 5. Therefore, an Ed Calvinist belief that he has assurance of salvation is not justified. So what does this mean? If you don't have justification for a belief, then that means you do not possess knowledge of that belief. So you cannot know that you're saved if Ed Calvinism is true. You can say you know it, you can assert it all you want, but it's just noise. You don't actually know it. And in fact, this is part of the theology of Calvin himself, where he talks about evanescent grace, where people fully believe they're saved. And then it turns out that God didn't elect them in the first place. So it's not just what Phil and I are concluding here logically. It's Calvin's own belief. You don't have, because look, you don't know, even if you didn't have our arguments based on Calvin's own teaching on evanescent grace, that means that people sincerely believe if they were strapped up to a lie detector, they could say, I have assurance of salvation, but guess what? They weren't one of the elect. And so God tricked them into thinking they were saved, but they weren't. How do you know that's not you? That's what I would say to Gavin. How do you know that's not you? What if you're just experiencing evanescent grace? Now, if you don't like that question, then you got to deal with these arguments that Phil and I have advanced.
Yeah, you have a universal epistemic defeater at that point. Yeah. And to help people understand, when I was teaching epistemology, the joke I'd make with my students, because students come in, don't even know what those terms mean. I'm like, okay, so I think I'm standing up here lecturing to you guys right now, and you'd need to give me some really, really good arguments to convince me that I was in Plato's cave or in the Matrix or something, really weird like that. But suppose instead you came to me and said, Professor Kahlberg, about 10 minutes before you started teaching the class, we just slipped some LSD into your coffee. Well, at that point, I have a universal epistemic defeater for every single one of my senses. I cannot believe anything that's going on is real until the LSD works its way out of my system. And that's basically what you're saying that this turns God into, is you now have a universal epistemic defeater for all of your beliefs. And so how on earth could you possibly be assured at that point? And I say to Gavin, I'm happy to hear that you're like rejecting this horrific conclusion that you can't have assurance of salvation. That just suggests to me then you need to go back and re-examine your foundations, because this seems to be where the foundations lead.
And I think the pastoral implications are not something to be ignored here either, because as somebody who did youth ministry for a really long time, pastoral implications of Calvinism, this is something people intuitively catch on to, even if they don't have philosophical training, or they intuitively go, well, but what if I'm not? Like, you're saying it's one of the elect. How do I know? It's like, well, because you believe. Well, what if I stop believing someday? And so then there are two ways I've seen people do this. And again, this is pastoral, again, not philosophical, theological. There's two ways I've seen other pastors handle this. And they go, well, you're just going to be saved anyway. At the end, like if you've ever expressed faith, then you apostate or whatever, if you're elect, you'll be saved anyway. You can have full assurance that that's the case. Well, okay, that kind of removes this idea of the holy life and sanctification and all of that stuff. And the other one is, well, you were never really saved in the first place. And that's that idea of evanescent grace. It's like, well, but I really thought I was. And this has apologetic implications too, because now you'll have people say, no, I really was a believer. I really fully believed that. And the presuppositionalists in apologetics with Calvinists will then say, well, either no, you didn't because you couldn't, because you weren't determined to do so. So you never actually did have that faith. Well, then why argue or debate at all at that point? So I think there's just some intuitions the lay people have, that even if Francis Turretin says that this is the case, and did say that it is the case, that it shows that it doesn't work out practically in people's lives. And it's not that they're bad thinkers, it's that their intuitions are likely leading them to the correct, reasonable path. Anyway, that's what I have.
There's really something to be said for if you can practically live out the view. This is not to say don't do higher level, really theoretical thing, don't get into modal logic. No, there's a place for that. But at the same time, if you come across a view and you're like, there's no way this could ever possibly apply in people's real life, and it strikes the average person as just so incredibly counterintuitive, that's a check against it. At least it should be most of the time. Not always, because, I mean, quantum physics is very counterintuitive, but we've got good reasons to accept that.
And And Josh, you brought up the pastoral approach.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, when I'm brought in to speak at different churches or youth groups or whatever, teenagers, I could be giving a lecture on the historical evidence of the resurrection, and then we go to the Q&A, and they want to skip straight to free will and God's sovereignty and human responsibility and predestination and determinism and all that. People ask, nobody cares about this philosophical mumbo jumbo, right? That's false. Put me in a room with teenagers and let's see what they ask. It's just we'll get to this issue very quickly, even if I don't lead them.
And to your point, I just had dinner with a guy the other day who was in my youth group who was like, I never thought of myself as interested in philosophy. But I asked these questions and I said, that's because you didn't know what philosophy was. you didn't realize you were doing philosophy. You thought philosophy was just, pontificating on things that don't really matter out in the ether, that sort of thing. Yeah. But philosophy has this, it's important. It has practical implications. And when you're asking those questions, you are doing philosophy. That's what you're doing. And he was like, oh yeah, I guess that's the case. So people say, well, I don't need philosophical mumbo jumbo. Usually what I think is, well, you think philosophy is something that it's not. And there are definitely areas of philosophy that is the ivory tower philosophical, like, wow, that was a fun conversation that had no real world meaning as I go out into life. But generally philosophy is figuring out the why, right? And so anyway,
hey, if you want to, Phil, let me know what you think, but I think we could jump to timestamp 1150.
Okay. Sure.
And there's one thing that we're skipping over is Gavin appealed to Augustine and Aquinas. And I'll just say for those viewing, in my book, Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism, each of those guys gets a chapter devoted to him. Augustine has a whole chapter. Aquinas has a whole chapter. In fact, if memory serves, I think I wrote more about Aquinas in his chapter than I did about Molina in his chapter. At least that was the case in the first edition.
I know you covered it a lot. I don't remember if it was more, but quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot. And I contend that Aquinas would affirm libertarian freedom. He would argue for libertarian free thinking, as he would affirm the free thinking argument. And he would also say that God was omniscient and knew how we would freely choose prior to creation. So that would make Aquinas a mere Molinist. And so I don't think that it makes sense for Gavin to be referencing Aquinas to defend the Calvinist position here. Augustine had differing views over the course of his life. His earlier beliefs, I think, were better than his older beliefs. I think he was losing it in his old age. And so I would refer people to earlier Augustine when he was much sharper. But yeah, Augustine was all over the place. And but if we're going to talk about Aquinas, I just want to point people to my book to read those different chapters and the rest of the book as well.
Hey, don't click out yet. Seriously, if you like this little snippet, you're gonna love the full episode. It's linked right there in the description. Go watch it when you're done here, or tap on one of these video recommendations for more stuff like this. If you're enjoying the content, a like and subscribe would mean the world, and it doesn't cost you anything. It helps us out a ton. Drop a comment too. Tell us what you thought. Thanks for hanging out. We'll catch you in the full vid.